So thank you so much for that introduction, and to Kali Aset for the invitation, and to the James Weldon Johnson Institute for having me here today. This is my first time speaking about this project here at Emory, which is a particular honor because, as you'll hear, faculty here have been fundamental in the research. I'm not going to talk a lot about the Emory piece today, and they are folks over in chemistry, so they might not be people that you know well, but I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A or afterwards. So today I'm going to speak from my larger book project in progress, which has the provisional title of Synthesizing Hope. The book draws on ethnographic research at iThemba Pharmaceuticals, which is a small startup pharmaceutical company in the outskirts of Johannesburg. It has an elite international scientific board, and it was founded in 2009 with a mission of drug discovery for TB, HIV, and malaria. The name iThemba means hope in Zulu. Unfortunately, the company was ultimately unsuccessful, and it closed its doors in 2015. Yet the company still provides a rich site for analysis. This particular place provides an entry point for thinking about how the location of the scientific knowledge component of pharmaceuticals, rather than their raw materials, production, licensing, or distribution, matters. I explore why it matters for the scientists themselves, and why it matters for those of us who are interested in global health and in post-colonial science. Consideration of this case illuminates the limitations of global health frameworks that implicitly posit rich countries in the global north as the unique site of knowledge production, and thus as the source of unidirectional knowledge flows to the global south. It also provides a concrete example for consideration of the context and practices of post-colonial science, its constraints, and its promise. South Africa is an interesting intermediary in global north-south bifurcation because its particular post-colonial context is shaped by its legacy of settler colonialism and the struggle against apartheid. South Africa is a relatively young democracy, and it's resource poor by global standards, and it has a large population of impoverished Black Africans with urgent unmet health needs and robust activist communities that have mobilized around demands for access to medicine. Thus, it's an obvious locale for mobilizations that have happened around the discourse of global health. At the same time, South Africa is highly developed by African standards, with a rich history of innovation in biomedicine, such as the first human heart transplant in 1967, and it has a now multiracial middle class with the education, resources, and global connections to plausibly participate in global science. In contemporary aspirations for South African science, a potential exists for these two South Africas to come together through science in the service of the people. So this particular multiracial team of scientists is actually not the scientists I work with. The bench scientists, these are chemical engineering students at the University of Cape Town. The bench scientists that I work with are not public figures, and so only on rare occasion do I actually reveal anything identifying about them, unlike the board of advisors and co-founders who are public figures. So my project draws extensively on the perspectives of iThemba's drug discovery scientists, who are comprised of two groups: the members of the company's management and scientific advisory board, who are internationally trained and based in the US, including Dennis Leota here at Emory, and in the UK, Switzerland, and South Africa, and the bench scientists who are trained in South Africa and were working in Johannesburg. Since beginning my research on this project in 2010, I've interviewed several of iThemba's management and scientific advisory board members, some in the US or the UK or South Africa, and I've taken several ethnographic trips to iThemba's labs and did participant observation on site. So Synthesizing Hope puts these kind of observations and interviews into a larger context of a much longer history. Colonial models in which Africa's role in the global economy was predominantly as a site of extraction of raw materials, of apartheid and struggles against it, of global health struggles since the emergence of AIDS, and of a generation of scientists that have come of age in an era defined by all of these intertwined histories and more. Today, I'll focus on how the project connects with imaginaries that are simultaneously socio-technical and non-racial. Although iThemba was not ultimately successful in achieving its goals, those goals are still a rich site of analysis. Imagined possibilities matter. What Sheila Jasanoff and Sunghyun Kim have described as socio-technical imaginaries are vital sites for thinking through not just what technology should be, but through what society should be. Because, in their phrasing, techno-scientific imaginaries are simultaneously also social imaginaries, encoding collective visions of the good society. The power of imagination might be easiest to see in kind of icons of scientific progress here in the US. So if you think about things like nuclear power or the space program or biomedical innovations such as the Salk vaccine, so these are particular technologies, but they're also particular visions of post-war United States and progress and futurity. In the South African context, the concept of socio-technical imaginary has been used to understand the foundational colonial articulations of South Africa as a racially segregated society and one with a highly developed mining sector. Historian William Kelleher Story has analyzed articulations of both race and engineering by Cecil John Rhodes, a key colonialist who shaped South African politics and industry in the late 19th century, and whose legacy has recently been contested around social movement with the hashtag Rhodes Must Fall. And which did successfully lead to the removal of a statue at the University of Cape Town to Cecil John Rhodes. A story convincingly argues that Rhodes was a visionary leader in business and politics who promoted advanced mine engineering while at the same time pressing for monopoly capitalism and racial discrimination, the socio-technical imaginary that emerged in late 19th century South Africa. The foundation of South Africa as a polity that was Rhodes's legacy is both social and political, and it's also mining and industrial. He marshaled the creation of a system in which a powerful extraction industry would rely on black labor but serve the white minority. This technological and industrial aspect of Rhodes's history has fallen a bit from prominence, but it's an important part of Rhodes' broader vision. As the monuments to this past are being dismantled, one of the things that I'm curious about is what socio-technical imaginaries are emerging in 21st century South Africa. I may be stretching the term socio-technical imaginary a bit by applying it to a small startup company. Jasanoff and Kim originally articulated the concept of socio-technical imaginaries at the level of the nation state. Jasanoff later extended it. Socio-technical imaginaries, she says, can be articulated and propagated by other organized groups, such as corporations, social movements, and professional societies. Though collectively held, socio-technical imaginaries can originate in the visions of individuals or small collectives, gaining traction through blatant exercises of power or sustained acts of coalition building. iThemba might be a questionable case for the concept from Jasanoff's perspective, since she argues that only when the originator's vanguard vision comes to be communally adopted does it rise to the level of imaginary. iThemba materialized to a non-trivial degree, becoming the site of commitment and energy by a network of international scientists, successfully gaining startup funding from the South African government, and existing as a space of bench scientific work over the course of several years. In Jasanoff's terms, key actors were able, at least to some degree, to mobilize the resources to make their visions durable. That said, the iThemba project was certainly not widely known about in South Africa or anywhere else, and it was not the site of social movements or of broader mobilization. Nevertheless, I find the concept of socio-technical imaginaries to be useful, as in Jasanoff's case, analysis of iThemba in these terms allows an exploration of the normativity of the imagination and the materiality of networks. So normativity here denotes claims about what should be done, and the materiality points to efforts to realize those aspirations in space and time. A socio-technical imaginary organized around iThemba's mission of locally discovered, affordable, innovative drugs for infectious diseases articulates South African scientific research and society in ways that are distinct from a range of alternative imaginaries, of aid complexes or plant-based therapies, or of extraction industries, or of colonial or apartheid-era science in which African populations were not seen as the principal beneficiaries of biomedical innovation. So this slogan here that iThemba used provides one route in. So consider the first I, inexpensive. This marks it as a socio-technical imaginary with the South African majority in mind. That's certainly in contrast to alternative socio-technical imaginaries from earlier eras, as I was just discussing with Cecil Rhodes. South African socio-technical enterprises from the colonial and apartheid era marshaled science and technology in the service of the white minority in initiatives ranging from computing and nuclear weapons to coal to liquid fuel technologies and to biomedical innovations such as the first heart transplant. This form of economic and political vision was contested at the time and throughout the long struggle against apartheid. I want to suggest that iThemba can be usefully understood as a socio-technical imaginary for a post-apartheid South Africa. The second I, infectious diseases, is continuous with the first. iThemba's focus was on therapies for TB, HIV, and malaria. TB and HIV are particularly urgent in South Africa, and malaria in the countries to its north. Whereas colonial and apartheid-era biomedical innovation in South Africa was predominantly imagined in the service of cosmopolitan elites, and the first heart transplant is again just a great example of this, iThemba's goals were imagined to be in the service of South African and African majorities. And whereas global pharma has become more focused on autoimmune diseases, degenerative diseases, mental illnesses, and cancers, which are all major issues in the global north and everywhere, iThemba centered diseases that are distinctly relevant in Africa. The third I, innovative chemistry, is at least as important. Most global health efforts aimed at addressing HIV, TB, and malaria in South Africa and beyond have been based on expanding access to existing therapies rather than developing innovative therapies. Exceptions, like the Bill Gates-funded Grand Challenges efforts, overwhelmingly fund researchers who are based in the global north. The idea that innovative chemistry should happen in South Africa and be directed biomedically rather than toward the mining industry is a distinctive aspect of this small pharmaceutical company. Another aspect of the innovative chemistry piece is that, unlike most pharmaceutical discovery efforts that have been explored in science and technology studies, my own field, and related fields, iThemba's methods were based on mainstream synthetic chemistry, indistinguishable from what might be done in well-equipped labs anywhere in the world, rather than on bioprospecting or traditional knowledges. The socio-technical imaginary of iThemba was thus distinct from global aid complexes, traditional knowledges, or science in the service of the white minority. Before getting further into the socio-technical imaginaries of iThemba, a few comments about non-racial imaginaries. Both its International Board of Advisors and its bench scientists described iThemba's project as African solutions for African problems. South Africa is, of course, a very problematic stand-in for the continent as a whole, but that moniker does important work. African is a remarkably flexible category. It's able to incorporate diverse South Africans as well as Black Africans from other parts of the continent who are working in South Africa. Africa is certainly an actors category in South Africa. It's invoked everywhere, in iThemba's logo, of course, and then also in posters like this. I started this research in 2010 and attended some of the first games of the World Cup. And this kind of iconography of South Africa as the African continent was everywhere and continues to be so. As post-colonial theorist Achille Mbembe has argued, whether produced by outsiders or by indigenous people, discourses on the continent are not necessarily applicable to their object. Their nature, their stakes, and their functions are situated elsewhere. They are deployed only by replacing this object, creating it, erasing it, decomposing it, and multiplying it. There is no description of Africa that does not involve destructive or mendacious functions. And yet, that does not render articulations of Africa inauthentic. Mbembe continues, but this oscillation between real and imaginary, the imaginary realized and the real imagined, does not take place solely in writing. This interweaving also takes place in life. For the scientists involved with iThemba, Africa is inescapably simultaneously real and imaginary. So what kind of imaginary is it? In some senses, the Africanness of iThemba scientists is resonant with that of the Freedom Charter of 1955, which declared, and it might be too small for you to see here, but that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white. This slogan only imprinted itself on the consciousness of most South Africans after 1990, with the unbanning of the ANC and Communist Party. This notion was incorporated into the preamble of South Africa's 1996 constitution, which declared that South Africa belongs to all who live in it. As historian Saul Dubau has argued, there is nothing self-evident about South Africa or South Africans, and the struggle for South Africa has always been, and in many ways continues to be, a struggle to become South African. Ithemba's notion of African is also resonant with the expansive articulation of Thabo Mbeki in his famous I Have an African speech. And these are the first few lines that talk about hills and valleys, but he goes on to talk a great deal about people. Later in the speech, he avows a connection to the indigenous Khoi and San people of South Africa, as well as migrants from Europe, Malay slaves, and then specific Xhosa, Sotho, Zulu, Venda, and Tsonga leaders, as well as further flung people from the continent. Ethiopians, Ashanti of Ghana, Berbers of the desert. As feminist legal scholar Laura Foster has pointed out, Mbeki's speech asserted racial difference by attending to South Africa's ancestral past, but subsumes difference under a privileged universal Africanness. It simultaneously marshaled difference and sameness to craft new terms of belonging in the nation state predicated on shared African identity. In conceptualizations of Ithemba's project by those involved at various levels, there is a persistent vacillation between non-racial and multiracial, and as anthropologist Kelly Gillespie points out, the correspondence of both conceptualizations has a long history in the African National Congress, or ANC. Even the famous moniker of Rainbow Nation, which was coined by Desmond Tutu and popularized by Nelson Mandela, points to that tension. The rainbow is recognizable by the presence of multiple distinct hues, even as it also exists as a unified object. So the natural icons that Mandela also kind of starts off his speech with are notable to me in part for their non-nativeness. Jacarandas are originally from South America, mimosas are from Australia, and are considered invasive in the Western Cape. The Rainbow Nation pointedly includes waves of immigrants in a new landscape, whether human or botanical. Like these articulations, Ithemba's notion of Africanness embraces white settlers in South Africa, and it embraces those from across the continent. It's worth noting that this is a distinctly elite discourse. As sociologist David Matsine has argued, the Africanness of South Africa and the South Africanness of Africa remained a thing of the elite, while the lower tiers of the figuration remained strongly parochial and chauvinistic. Yet, I don't think that it undoes the power of the articulations to point out that they are elite articulations. And there are also differences between these kinds of articulations and those of the scientists. Whereas Mbeki and Mandela hearken to landscape and to past greatness, the scientists eschew this kind of mythologizing and poetry. So, to explore the tension between plural multiracial imaginaries and non-racial imaginaries, and how it comes to matter in the socio-technical imaginary of Ithemba, I will discuss two sets of perspectives. First, I will discuss the account of a prehistory of Ithemba from a white South African co-founder. He describes his efforts to sustain R&D under the new regime during the country's democratic transition, and his articulation vacillates between plural, complicatedly racial means toward achieving his desired ends, which is of a multiracial, post-apartheid science at a global standard of excellence. Then I will discuss some perspectives of a few bench scientists of diverse backgrounds whose engagements with race are more implicit, but also rich. For bench scientists of all backgrounds, references to the Black majority generally happen through national and regional proxies, serving Africa or South Africa. For some Black scientists, they talked about serving people in their hometown. For this elite but idealistic group, the desire to do science by the people, for the people, was earnest but complex. So first, this prehistory piece. Oh, actually, let me hold off on that. So one of the company's co-founders, Frank Fisher, was a senior figure in South African research and development in science during the democratic transition, so during the 1990s. In that period, Fisher was in the leadership of the African Explosives and Chemical Industries, or AECI, as he told me in an interview in 2010. So the board of the AECI put pressure on every manager to start employing Blacks. He came to realize that if research and development were to continue to be supported under the new regime, they would have to be more inclusive. And I'm struck that this is, in a way, an affirmative action logic, but what's being affirmed is distinct. So if we imagine that affirmative action logics in general affirm the subjects that they are targeted toward. So if you imagine affirmative action for African Americans is affirming full citizenship and the right to participate among African Americans. Here, what is being affirmed is actually science. So if in the new regime that has to be by and for the majority, science is not relevant, it will not continue. And he is trying to make that happen in plural ways. So Fisher thought that hiring black PhDs was a fine idea, but there were obstacles. So there were very few black PhDs in South Africa at the time, and he was unsatisfied with the quality of black PhD scientists produced there, which he saw as a legacy of an apartheid system. Fisher explained that during apartheid, blacks had to go to separate universities for their undergraduate degrees, but black-serving educational institutions didn't train PhDs. So there were a few black PhDs trained at then white institutions, such as the University of Cape Town, but, he said, quote, the staff of the University of Cape Town, generally speaking, they didn't expect blacks to do as well as the white guys. It was all sort of accepted that they wouldn't be quite as good, and that bothered me. He believed that experience at an international university, where high expectations were set for all students, black students included, would improve the quality of black scientists that he could hire. So this might be read as a projection of a non-racial imperial home for science. Fisher organized an exchange program with a longtime AECI consultant, Professor Tony Barrett at Imperial College, London. As Barrett told me in an interview at his office in London in 2014, he first went to South Africa in 1982. So as he put it, this was before it was fashionable. Right? So this is his kind of tactful way of saying that he had collaborated with the apartheid regime as a scientific advisor. But then this actually made him a very good participant for scientific networks in the post-apartheid regime as well, because he already had these connections with these now senior people in South Africa. So according to Fisher, this exchange program was very successful, and he was not surprised because you put the best students in really good university and they're going to do quite well. Fisher retired from the AECI soon after, but it seemed to him that the students trained are still doing well, and many are now senior figures in South African government and industry. It was Fisher's English collaborator Barrett who suggested expanding the program to his friends here in Atlanta, including brothers Charlie Leota at Georgia Tech and Dennis Leota at Emory. Barrett suggested that the presence of large numbers of affluent African Americans in Atlanta would have a positive influence on these black graduates, and Fisher was receptive. In this way, the aspiration for a world-class black scientific workforce was linked to the aspiration for a black middle class and professional elite. This was a more explicitly multiracial frame. If British universities and cities were imagined to be less racist than South African ones, American and especially Atlantan universities were better because black excellence in leadership was so prominent in science and beyond. The project of training scientists to participate in research and development after apartheid was thus both a scientific and a social enterprise. As one of Emory's, and once Emory's Dennis Leota was on the board, he has tremendous accomplishment in the drug discovery area. He and collaborators discovered second-generation antiretrovirals, so those are the ones that have turned HIV into a chronic disease for those with access to the drugs. And so his involvement both kind of made this connection to Atlanta and aspirations of a particular notion of black middle class, and put the drug discovery mission on the table more prominently. By the time that he was involved in co-founding of iThemba in the early 2000s, Frank Fisher also had a second goal, in addition to training black graduates. He wanted to bring back white South African scientists who had emigrated to Europe. Fisher had worked with many excellent scientists over the years at AECI, and he wanted them to return and contribute to their country. In a sense, he operates with plural multiracial imaginaries, seeing a future for white scientists as well as for black scientists, together in an implicitly non-racial imaginary of simply training and retaining as many scientists as possible. So notably, for Fisher, there were very global means to these very local ends. Motivated by the need to hire black PhDs so that scientific research would be supported in South Africa's democratic era, Fisher sought ties with international scientists who could assist in the training. Exchange programs focused on strengthening the education of black PhDs, and they also deepened the relationships with the UK and US-based scientists who would become the other co-founders of iThemba. This, in turn, would be a way to realize a vision of creating inspiring work opportunities for diverse South Africans in R&D. Fisher played an important role in successfully gaining funding from the South African government for this enterprise. Colonial and apartheid-era South Africa had an extensive history of state-owned enterprises that benefited the white minority. This 20th century legacy created a situation in which it was reasonable to seek funding from the South African government for an enterprise that was a business one, but that would benefit South Africans in the 21st century. However, because post-apartheid state is avowedly market-oriented, the stage was set for hybrid models of public-private partnership. Insofar as its roots are in trying to bring Black South Africans into R&D, iThemba's roots can be connected to other post-colonial efforts to Africanize science. In the non-academic sense of the word as it is used in other regions of Africa, as in Africanization of the civil services. The fact that the company was 51% owned by the South African government makes the civil services frame particularly apt. And yet, as is common in post-apartheid South Africa, iThemba operated with two senses of who counts as an African. One specifically focused on the Black majority population of the country, and one that is far more expansive, including Black, white, and Asian South Africans, as well as Black Africans from other countries in the region. This is a very circumscribed notion of Africanization, because the central idea is just to bring Africans into an already established field that is not anticipated to be transformed. There is little chance of Africanizing synthetic chemistry in a way analogous to what Lynn Shoemaker talks about as Africanizing anthropology. Attentive to the processes of fieldwork, Shoemaker argues that African assistants and informants had a role in shaping anthropology's knowledge construction about them, and she highlights anthropological knowledge-making as a collective process rather than an individual one. My own fieldwork has found drug discovery to be certainly a collective process, and iThemba's goal was to shape knowledge-making about African diseases, but drug discovery is a mature field of practice that would be very hard for Africans to reshape, and none of those involved were interested in creating a whole new field. Yet a third sense of Africanization can help to understand iThemba as well. Esperanza Brizuela Garcia's discussion of Africanization of African history as an endeavor for greater authenticity and relevance. With its racially diverse staff, global networks, and lack of tie to indigenous knowledges, iThemba may be a weak case for authentically African knowledge, yet because its founding goals were to find inexpensive new drugs for TB, HIV, and malaria, it was certainly striving for relevant knowledge. And this gets me to this issue of the Rainbow Nation at the bench. So one of the slogans that came up in the interviews, not only with the people who were trying to get funding for this thing, but also the people doing the work, the bench scientists, was this idea of African solutions for African problems. As I mentioned, South Africa is a very problematic stand-in for the continent as a whole, but the moniker does important work. Africa is an actor's category routinely invoked by the Africans themselves. It's remarkably flexible, and it's able to incorporate the South Africans of diverse ethnicities, as well as the many Black Africans who are working in science, who are from countries neighboring South Africa to the north. So the scientific advisors of the company were trained at, and mostly continue to be based at places in Cambridge, UK, and Emory in Atlanta, but the bench scientists all had meaningful African roots. The bench scientists at iThemba included white, Indian, and Black South Africans from varied ethnic groups, as well as Black scientists from Zambia, Zimbabwe, Lesotho, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. They had all received their PhDs in South Africa, mostly at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg and the University of Cape Town, and a few at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. And so they were already familiar with working in this kind of demographic environment. They were a young group, often straight out of their PhDs, and generally less than a decade into their careers. Most were born in the 1980s, and so they were not quite born free, to use the term that is used to describe South Africans born after the transition to democracy in 1994. But they came of age in an already democratic context. Post-apartheid legacies informed the context into which they articulated their belonging as scientists and as people. They are idealistic young adults, well interpolated by slogans by kind of cartoons like these. Strikingly, the bench scientists at iThemba used African and South African interchangeably in their interviews, whether they were from South Africa or further north. They rarely talked about race explicitly, but it was a prominent implicit theme. One way that iThemba's work was rooted in place is connected to scientists' personal experiences with disease. The company was founded with a distinct focus on HIV, TB, and malaria, and some of the scientists were drawn to drug discovery by their own personal experiences with these diseases. For example, one scientist who was from a country neighboring South Africa to the north told me of the origins of his interest in science in his own experience of malaria when he was a teenager. More frequently, the scientists at iThemba spoke of intimacy with the diseases in their communities and their region as being inextricable from the urgency of doing the research. As one scientist put it, "I think that it is important that people who are affected are the ones who are doing the research. Because if you have seen someone suffer, you make all the effort to ensure that whatever you are doing gets out and ordinary people can benefit from it. You clearly understand the importance of doing it. Even people in other countries, they still understand, but the fact that it has affected you, you feel the strong need of intervention, the strong need of finding something that will be helpful and will be accessed in a cheaper way." So I asked her, "Have you felt the impact of malaria, TB, and HIV?" And she said, "Not malaria, but HIV, yes, absolutely. There are many people who have died of HIV and TB who are very close to us, especially HIV. They always say that if you are not infected, you are affected." So this sense of all Southern Africans as affected by HIV is connected to a second way in which iThemba's project is articulated as rooted in place. Unlike most scientists working in the US, for example, the scientists at iThemba all seem to be aware that HIV as a medical problem is inextricable from HIV as a social problem, and that biomedical solutions are just one part of needed change. For the racially diverse scientists involved, the importance of taking responsibility for AIDS and other infectious diseases is often linked with the moral imperative for South African scientists to focus on the needs not only of the global or South African elite, but also for the poor and Black South African majority, as well as spreading that benefit to other countries on the continent. One scientist, a Black South African who grew up poor, told me, "I think also we have to do like the first world countries. When you go to the United States or the United Kingdom, they have high investment in research and development, and research at the end of the day works for them. Versus in Africa, of course we have highly talented people in this country and in Africa in general, but we haven't seen much of science responding to the actual needs. What it means for science to address the needs of people down in my hometown, where they are facing TB and HIV. And so that is where my social aspect comes from, is how do you make science respond? Science and education needs to address what we are facing in this country." So this scientist is unduly optimistic about what happens in countries like the United States and the United Kingdom. It's certainly not the case that science always serves the needs of our publics either. And yet I think it's interesting. We might read Africa and down in my hometown as terms for Blackness, even as the racialization remains implicit. References to both personal experiences and the needs of the people are ways that scientists at iThemba can be understood to be producing situated knowledge. Like all knowledge producers, the scientists at iThemba are looking from somewhere. In contrast to most global North scientists, they're highly aware of that. iThemba was working to make medicines for the people, low-cost medicines for neglected diseases, but it was also working to make medicines by the people. As a racially diverse group of highly educated people outside of the malaria zone, there's a tension in whether the scientists at iThemba are themselves the people or are just serving the people. The scientists are themselves part of a Southern African people, albeit a relatively privileged part, and they're trying to help themselves too. I asked one scientist, "Is it important that R&D work happen here in South Africa?" And he said, "It's been long overdue. The country has produced a lot of top-class scientists, and it's only fair that they should be a lot more involved in research and development. Obviously, it puts the country on the global map. But you also want to create employment opportunities for a lot of the students that are studying chemistry. One of the major questions that science students have once finished with these studies is, what next? Thus, if drug development takes place in South Africa, it is for chemists in South Africa as much as it is for desperately poor patients co-infected with TB and HIV. The political is also the personal, and these scientists are trying to find a way to make a living and a life in real time." This is the element that connects most continuously with my previous work, Medicating Race, which analyzed race, heart disease, and pharmaceuticals in the United States. One way that African American physician researchers have laid claim to the importance of their participation in research communities is to argue that African American patients matter. Not only the ethical importance of providing African American patients with already existing therapies, but also the importance of centering African American patients in innovation. To the extent that iThemba was successful in making compelling claims on both South African publics and global science, the African scientists became, like the African American geneticists described by Alondra Nelson, bioculture brokers. They deploy authentic expertise available to them as minorities and as community-minded professionals to forge consensus in and between biomedicine, scientific domains, policy circles, and the public. They position themselves as native speakers of two discourses, global science and African democracy, uniquely situated to making the former accountable to the latter. The spatialization of pharmaceutical subjects and objects should be understood together. Ambitious African scientists are striving to be the subjects of medical progress, which is to say, practitioners of scientific research at a global level. Yet place still matters. They cite their co-location with important objects of medical knowledge, impoverished Africans with urgent unmet needs, to make a claim for a role for themselves in the global networks of science. Their cosmopolitan aspirations are rooted in their context. It's notable that the hope-for drugs are context-specific without being expensive, and so they might be uniquely situated to be democratic. These scientists are trying to make indigenous pharmaceuticals of a very particular kind, not autochthonous, but meaningfully their own. Drug discovery is a particularly interesting site of analysis of these socio-technical imaginaries because pharmaceuticals are readily recognized as material and semiotic, in which it is possible for objects to carry both matter and meaning. Anthropologists of pharmaceuticals have overwhelmingly focused on later stages of pharmaceuticals, so clinical trials, marketing, consumption. Many in science and technology studies and related fields have described the ways that, for advocates and consumers and correspondingly for marketers, pharmaceuticals become sites of hope. For example, Joe Dumet has insightfully unpacked the work done by direct-to-consumer advertisements that intone, "There is hope." But early-stage pharmaceutical science can also be a site for reconfiguring facts and social orders. For consumers, all drugs are recreational, sites for recreating ourselves and our worlds. And for scientists, they can be too. Anthropologists of pharmaceuticals have explored how pharmaceuticals can help to make dis-ease concrete for both patients and physicians. And here, we can see how they can help to make hope concrete for synthetic chemists, for a time at least in their and also for a time at least for their South African governmental funders. Synthesizing hope follows how pharmaceuticals become sites of hope for those who would discover and fabricate essential new drugs. At iThemba and in South Africa more broadly, socio-technical imaginaries envisioning what science and technology should be and what society should be are necessarily intertwined with plural, non-racial, and multiracial imaginaries. Thank you.